The war in Ukraine drags on. The headlines may have shifted, but the battles haven't. Aid is running low, economies are unraveling, and Western promises are beginning to echo hollow. In July 2025, the United States quietly suspended key arms deliveries to Ukraine Patriot missiles, GMLRS rockets, Hellfire citing concerns about depleted stockpiles. Meanwhile, France has admitted its cupboards are empty. Macron himself said, "We cannot give what we don't have." Ukraine's President Zelensky is begging for $40 billion per year just to survive. But even at the NATO summit, Donald Trump gave no firm commitment. Instead, he shook hands, smiled, and walked away. As the war approaches its fourth year, one thing is becoming clear. This isn't just about weapons. It's about political fatigue, economic collapse, and the hard limits of propaganda. Morgan Freeman once said, in that voice heavy with wisdom, "When you build your dreams on illusions, the fall is not a chance, it's a promise." And as the smoke clears, we ask, is Ukraine winning or merely bleeding? Stay with us until the end. What you'll hear might just shift how you see this war and what comes next. Let us know your thoughts below. Is this the beginning of the end or just another phase of a much bigger game? On the 1st of July, 2025, NBC and Politico both confirmed a quiet but seismic decision. The U.S. Pentagon has suspended multiple weapons shipments to Ukraine. These aren't minor tools. These are the spine of Kyiv's defensive arsenal. Patriot interceptor missiles, air-to-air aim and Stinger missiles, hundreds of Hellfire and GMLRS rockets, and tens of thousands of 155mm artillery shells are now off the table. The official excuse is that American stockpiles are running dangerously low, a phrase that now sounds almost rehearsed. But behind the curtain, something deeper is unfolding, a change in posture, in strategy, and perhaps even in intention. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth initiated an internal audit, a review that, according to insiders, was less about arithmetic and more about geopolitics. The Trump administration, since taking office in January, has refused to authorize any new military assistance to Ukraine. The leftover weapons from the Biden administration are dwindling fast, with estimates suggesting the remaining aid might barely last into early autumn. Anna Kelly, Deputy Press Secretary at the White House, tried to soften the blow. Her statement that the decision was taken to prioritize domestic defense. American interests come first, she insisted. But Kelly didn't confirm which exact systems were being held back, nor how long this freeze might last. It's not just Washington watching nervously. Kyiv is furious. In late June, President Volodymyr Zelensky met Donald Trump face-to-face during the NATO summit in The Hague. The outcome? Empty smiles, vague gestures, and no hard commitments. Trump told him that assembling more Patriot systems would be difficult, and said only that he would look into it. That wasn't a yes. That wasn't even a maybe. For Ukraine, the symbolism is just as painful as the silence. When the most heavily armed nation in the world begins to ration its weapons, the message is clear: the faucet is closing. The era of endless arms shipments may be over, and Washington is laying the groundwork for the exit ramp without ever calling it one. And as Washington reconsiders its place in the proxy war, Europe isn't far behind, confronting its own breaking point. Starting in Paris, President Emmanuel Macron has finally admitted what many in Brussels whispered but never said aloud: France is out of weapons to send to Ukraine. In a televised interview broadcast on TF1, Macron looked directly at the camera and said, quote, "We've given all we can. We cannot give what we don't have." That wasn't just a line, it was a eulogy for the illusion of limitless European support. Since February 2022, France has pledged more than 3.7 billion euros, roughly $4.1 billion in military aid to Ukraine. But the French military was never designed for sustained ground warfare. It is a professional force, compact, not equipped for the demands of years-long foreign entanglement. And now, the cracks are visible. Last year, France's budget deficit swelled to 5.8% of GDP, blowing past EU thresholds. National debt now exceeds 110% of GDP, while economic growth projections for 2025 barely scrape past 0.9%. Macron tried to frame his policy as cautious realism. We must help Ukraine defend itself, he said, but we must not trigger a third world war. That comment struck a nerve, not just in Kyiv, but across Europe. The suggestion that further aid might ignite global conflict raised alarms, especially when France has already refused to send troops, weapons, or resources beyond what it already committed. Even recent discussions about the theoretical deployment of French troops to Ukraine, if a peace deal were to be struck, have been treated as diplomatic fantasy. Moscow, unsurprisingly, took none of it lightly. The Kremlin responded with warnings that any NATO presence on Ukrainian soil would be treated as provocation, citing the alliance's expansion as one of the root causes of the conflict. This sentiment is not new in Moscow, but it gains power when leaders like Macron begin to mirror the concern. As Morgan Freeman once observed, some lead with fire in their hearts, but their minds count coins. War, to them, is just another line in the ledger. Macron's comments prove the point. The war has become too expensive to sustain financially, politically, and socially. It's not just artillery that's running out. It's appetite and perhaps even belief. What began as a crusade to save European security now looks more like a managed retreat. And as Europe acknowledges its own fatigue, Ukraine finds itself cornered, not just by Moscow's missiles, but by its partners' limits. As July arrives, the economic forecast for Ukraine grows more desperate by the day. On the 28th of June, Theodai VOV, a sobering report outlined the scale of the challenge. Ukraine needs $40 billion every single year just to keep fighting. That figure doesn't include reconstruction, recovery, or social services. It's the price tag of war, and Kyiv is fast running out of people willing to foot the bill. At the moment, much of the country's civilian spending is being propped up by interest generated from frozen Russian assets held abroad. But even those returns are projected to fall short by the year 2026. Ukrainian Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko delivered a stark message to lawmakers. They should prepare for at least 2 more years of war, and that's the optimistic scenario. In his words, even if a peace deal is reached earlier, deep budget cuts will be unavoidable. And yet, as Vitaly Vavrishchuk, former director of financial stability at the National Bank of Ukraine, put it, there's nowhere left to cut. Education, off limits. Healthcare, already stretched thin. Public sector salaries have flatlined, and social services are buckling under pressure. Meanwhile, the private sector is hollowing out. Western firms that once flooded in with optimism are now pulling out quietly, citing risk, instability, and a lack of guarantees. In Kyiv, business owners have abandoned long-term planning entirely. Some are operating on monthly budgets, cutting costs to bare bones just to stay afloat. One local entrepreneur told the press, "We only plan 1 month at a time now. There's no other way to survive." The infrastructure that supports economic life is also under constant threat. Drone and missile strikes have damaged power grids, water supplies, and telecom networks. Internet outages and hospital disruptions are no longer rare. They are routine. Zelensky may have secured over $43 billion in defense funding, but that does nothing for the millions of civilians trying to buy food, medicine, and shelter. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development may still be promising long-term investment, but the private sector is not buying it. A Western investor working in Kyiv confessed, "We're not writing new checks. We'll talk again when there's a ceasefire. Until then, it's just risk. Ukraine's economy isn't in decline, it's in suspension. All it can do now is wait. Wait for aid, wait for peace, or wait for collapse. And survival, when built on speculation, is a fragile currency, especially when your allies begin to lose faith. At the NATO summit held in The Hague during the final week of June, President Donald Trump finally gave voice to what had long been whispered in private. The war in Ukraine is not going according to plan. I thought this would be easy, Trump admitted in a press briefing on the 25th of June. It's not. He described Russian President Vladimir Putin as a tough opponent and said the conflict is far more complex than what we've seen before. That wasn't just an offhand remark. It was a signal that the Trump administration is recalibrating its expectations and, more importantly, its commitments. In Kyiv, the reaction was predictably tense. Zelensky had hoped for a renewed pledge, a clear statement of support, or at the very least, a promise of more weapons. Instead, he got silence and shifting priorities. Within the summit halls, attention had drifted elsewhere. Delegates were talking about China, energy grids, artificial intelligence, and defense posture in the Indo-Pacific. Ukraine, once NATO's moral centerpiece, has become a side note, and Trump's famous claim that he could end the war within 24 hours now sounds more like theater than strategy. Behind closed doors, his administration is in talks to secure access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, a resource-rich sector the U.S. sees as essential for recovering part of the hundreds of billions spent under previous administrations. This is not charity. This is leverage. Transactional diplomacy at its rawest. As Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, pointed out, this shows the real limits of Western capacity and shifting U.S. military priorities. What once looked like unity now appears more like fragmentation. NATO, for all its public declarations, seems increasingly disjointed, and Trump's real message, between the lines, was simple. Ukraine must prepare to stand on its own, or prepare to trade something in return for each new shipment of aid. And with NATO distracted and transactional, Ukraine must now navigate a battlefield where even allies come with invoices. By mid-2025, the war effort in Ukraine is being sustained by three things: borrowed money, borrowed weapons, and borrowed time. Experts in Kyiv are increasingly blunt. Timofey Milovanov, head of the Kyiv School of Economics, stated, "There's no sustainable scenario without peace." And the numbers back him up. Inflation is eroding wages. Public workers have seen no significant raises. The minimum wage has been frozen since last year. And while prices continue to rise, household income stagnates or falls. Ukraine's economy is now caught in a pressure cooker, fed by uncertainty and the dwindling patience of its allies. Western aid, both from the U.S. and the European Union, is now highly conditional, renewed only year to year, often tied to elections and subject to sudden reversals. Every delay in Washington or Brussels sends ripple effects through Ukraine's government ministries, delaying salaries, halting procurement, or freezing key programs. In this environment, military recruitment becomes harder, not easier. Families are reluctant to see sons or husbands sent into a war that no longer has clear objectives or guaranteed support. And while Russia has its own costs, it is betting that it can wait longer than the West can sustain enthusiasm. On the ground, the cost of resistance is staggering. Ukraine is bleeding manpower, equipment, and morale at a pace no economy can absorb. Meanwhile, propaganda efforts to frame the war as a struggle for European values ring increasingly hollow. People want results, not rhetoric. The battlefield isn't the only front line. The real struggle now is endurance. Who can outlast whom? If Ukraine's allies continue to pretend this model can be sustained indefinitely, the consequences will be strategic and irreversible. Morgan Freeman once said, his voice steady with the weight of truth, "Wars don't end when the cheering stops. They end when the supplies run dry and the stories we tell ourselves fall apart." That moment may be approaching. For Ukraine, the illusion of stability is wearing thin, and illusions, once broken, don't return. Which leaves only one question. Is Ukraine fighting for victory or merely postponing the inevitable? The war in Ukraine didn't begin with truth, and it won't end with it either. What we're witnessing isn't just battlefield fatigue, it's geopolitical burnout. Washington is pulling back, Paris is drained, Kyiv is desperate, and Moscow, patient, calculating, and watching. Both Ukraine and the West face a choice: keep pretending or start negotiating. Morgan Freeman once said, his words carrying the quiet power of a storm, "Wars don't end with the last shot fired. They end when the last dream breaks." That dream may be cracking right now, in press conferences, in empty stockpiles, and in the silent nods of leaders who once promised victory. And you, watching this, are part of the audience to history. Let us know what you see from where you stand.